Welcome back, everybody, to Everyday A&P. We're going to continue learning about the eukaryotic cell, and today we want to focus on a pretty important topic, which is the plasma membrane. Sometimes you might hear it as the phospholipid bilayer. Those are synonymous. We're talking about the membrane that protects the cell and keeps what's inside, and what's outside, outside. So let's get right into it. First and foremost, we want to talk about the fluid mosaic model. What is this? Well, it is a mosaic of components, and primarily components that are fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. So these are the three components that we are typically going to find within this plasma membrane, which is composed and makes up this fluid mosaic model, right? And what it does is that what this fluid mosaic model really is that it has fluidity within the membrane, right? So things aren't just stationary where they're sitting. They have the ability to actually be fluid and move across the plasma membrane. So as we get into it, right, we want to just cover the brief overview of the plasma membrane. In the future videos, we're going to definitely go more in depth to the different functions and roles that the plasma membrane plays in terms of daily function. So I wanted to talk about cholesterol first and foremost. We talked about fats right here, which is a component, right, of the fluid mosaic model. So we have cholesterol, which is a pretty large component of the plasma membrane, a pretty large component of fats in the plasma membrane. And what it does is it modulates this membrane fluidity. What does that mean? Well, when our body or when the plasma membrane itself is in high temperatures, right, the cholesterol is going to decrease membrane fluidity. Decrease membrane fluidity. What does that mean? Well, it's going to stop being so flexible because, well, if it gets too hot, we could, open up a little bit too much and we can have components from the inside exiting the cell, and we don't want that. Now, on the opposite end, when we have low temperatures, we're in freezing temperatures, it's wintertime, it's, December, January time, and it's freezing. What is this cholesterol going to do? It's going to do the complete opposite. It's going to increase membrane fluidity. Increase membrane fluidity. And the reason behind this is because we don't want the plasma membrane to freeze up and solidify. We want it to remain fluid. That's the key word for today, fluid, right? Now, we talk about the membrane and the membrane itself, and we talked about these different proteins that could be found within the plasma membrane. So I wanted to cover a little bit about the types of proteins that we could potentially encounter when we study the plasma membrane. So we're going to go right down here, and there's three classes of these plasma of the plasma membrane, right? Three classes of proteins. Membrane proteins is what we call them. And the first class, we're going to call them transmembrane proteins. Transmembrane, otherwise also known as integral proteins. Now, what does this mean, right? This category actually has three components, right? We'll just label them A, B, and C. So if we look at this picture right here, this blue figure right here, we can consider this as a transmembrane or an integral protein. Why is that? Well, first and foremost, we have to identify within the cell the intra and extracellular components, right? So if this is our plasma membrane, right, this would be our intra or our inside of the cell, right? And this would be our extra or outside of the cell, right? So in transmembrane or integral proteins, we're going to have one component which is known as the hydrophilic component, hydrophilic or water-loving, right? Hydrophilic domain, and that's going to be on the interior of the cell, which is on the interior of the cell. So looking back at this picture right here, we could say that this part is going to be that hydrophilic domain that is within or participates in the interior of the cell. The second component that we can identify is the hydrophobic or water-fearing. Water-fearing. And why is that? Well, within the plasma membrane, we have these components right here that you see known as the phospholipids, right? And we have two layers of them, 1 and 2, and that's why we called it the phospholipid membrane, right? Bilayer. And these phospholipids are actually hydrophobic, so they are not going to interact with water. So we have a hydrophobic membrane that anchors the cell, or anchors it to the cell membrane, right? The domain anchors to the cell membrane. So we covered this middle portion right here. And then we have one more portion remaining, which is the another hydrophilic, right? Because it's water-loving. Hydrophilic, but this time it's going to interact with the extracellular environment. Interacts with extracellular environment. All right. And they're very common, right? And they're important classes of these membrane proteins. A few examples of this would be the proton pumps that we'd see, the ion channels, or even G protein coupled receptors, which we'll further cover when we talk a little bit more about the biochemistry that occurs within. The next component that I wanted to cover, the next component of these membrane proteins are called peripheral proteins. Whoops. Let's change that color. Peripheral proteins. Right? Now, what are these peripheral proteins? Let's use a different color here. So, these are attached to the integral membrane proteins, or they're associated with peripheral regions of the lipid bilayer. So what does that mean? They interact with biological membranes, and they're only going to be on function within the cytoplasm, right? So this category would include enzymes. So they interact with the cytoplasm. And an example that we could put down is enzymes, right? So, what does that mean? Well, let's look at the picture, right? Our integral proteins, again, we have the cytoplasm found on the inside of the cell, and so our integral proteins are going to be, or our peripheral proteins, are going to be found within the side that interacts with the cytoplasm. And lastly, the third type of membrane protein that we'll look into are lipid-anchored proteins. Now, what is a lipid-anchored proteins and where are they located? They're first and foremost, they're going to be located on the surface of the cell. Surface of cell. So that means on the extracellular side, and they're covalently bound to single or multiple lipid molecules that anchor proteins, right? That anchor proteins within the membrane. Within the membrane. without contacting the membrane itself, right? They're not going to contact the membrane itself. So what does that mean? We have an example, if you could see right here, where we have this type of protein, but it's connected not directly to the lipid itself, but it's connected and anchored to a specific type of protein. All right. So those are the three components or the three classes rather, of membrane proteins that we could see within the actual plasma membrane. And that's something I wanted to cover as we will dive deeper into the role and the function of the plasma membrane. But I wanted to cover the main component of the fluid mosaic model and how it is composed of fats, proteins, carbs, and how the role of cholesterol changes depending on the type of temperature, whether it's high or low, within the body, and how it affects the plasma membrane, along with the three proteins, or the three classes of membrane proteins that we covered today. All right, so that is all for today. Please continue liking, subscribing, and sharing these videos. Keep learning, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care, everybody.